Thanks for coming. And yeah, I was just about to start the agenda and go over what we're going to be doing today. So we'll start with an icebreaker. This is something we do every SI session and the regular sessions as well. Just kind of a little thing to get us going, get us talking about the topics. Then we're going to do a little Kahoot practice quiz. It's just 5 questions, but as we go through it, we'll just talk about the questions and the answers and kind of further discuss these learning objectives. Then I have a table chart, which I started actually at the first session with those that attended then, but I'll share it with you guys. It has all the learning objectives listed, and then we'll go through and define some more from the last couple lectures. Lastly, do a little closing where we just kind of reflect on what we talked about today and talk about maybe something new that you picked up today. So this icebreaker is called Take a Stance. And we talked about this in class, but did Napoleon further the French Revolution, or was he a counter-revolutionary? And what do you guys think about that? This was, something obviously Professor Baiko talked about as kind of a major historical argument that a lot of historians talk about with this time period. So I thought it'd be fun just to and it's just your opinion, so don't feel like there's no right or wrong answer here, of course. So I'll just say, for me, I feel like he was more of a counter-revolutionary, despite the stability he brought to France, which you could argue definitely did help maintain the revolution. All the, anti-republic kind of things he did, limiting free speech and, becoming an emperor and stuff like that. To me, I feel like he's a little more of a counter-revolutionary figure, but I'm curious to hear what you guys think. So let me know in the chat if you think, you can just say yeah or no, or you don't have to elaborate too much, but I'd love to hear what you guys think about it. So Joshua, you said counter-revolutionary because he essentially restored an authoritarian government, rigged elections, forced agreements. Yeah, that's kind of how I feel as well. Like I say, I can see the other argument. Miguel, what do you think? Yeah, you say he definitely helped the revolution, but overall you think he's a counter-revolutionary also because he became a monarch and took control of many aspects of French life. Yeah, I agree. I think it definitely helped, so it's really an interesting argument. But at the same time, if you become a monarch, it's not really what you think of the ideals of the revolution, right? So how did Napoleon change the relationship between the church and state in France? I have about 30 seconds to answer. You get no pressure. Don't feel bad if you're not sure about this. We'll discuss it in a second. Cool. Yeah. So I was trying to be a little tricky with this one. Obviously, the yellow recognizes the role of the church in French society and makes compromises. That is one of the ways that Napoleon changed the relationship between the church and state. However, I could see how you could get tripped up and think about the forcing the clergy to make a loyalty oath. So it's important to remember that the relationship between the church and the state went through a lot during the revolution, right? And a big part of the revolution was anti-church, anti-clericalism, right? They felt that people need to focus more on reason than religion, but also the power of the church was a problem in their minds. It's kind of added to that tradition that was repressing a lot of people. So during the revolution, Robespierre and them forced clergy members to make a loyalty oath to the revolution. When Napoleon takes power, he in turn recognizes how deep the church, or how much the church is involved in French society. And so it's really not something he sees that is kind of worth the fight, for a lack of better words, right? And he ends up making a compromise. Do either of you remember what the actual compromise was called? Yeah, Joshua, some concord, right? Miguel, I remember learning that in lecture. I think the Pope ordered the execution of those clergy members. Yeah, there was, I don't remember if he ordered their execution, but there was definitely, yeah, if you swore loyalty to the revolution, I'm pretty sure the Pope kind of excommunicated you or whatever. But yes, as you were saying, Joshua, it was called the Concordat. Um, not Concord. Yeah, like you say, it's kind of a weird word, Concordat. I'll type it in the chat. So that was the compromise between Napoleon and the church. Basically, it helped in the conflict between the church and state, like I said, that had been going on during the revolution. The church lost their monopoly on education. However, the Pope was given the power to select bishops out of a list of appointees that Napoleon would appoint. So it kind of helped set this balance between the church and state during Napoleon's reign. And at the same time, it also set off this kind of competition in the education sector between secular state education and religious churches, which I know if you guys remember, Professor Baiko talked a lot about how the churches in France were dominated. I'm sorry, the schools in France were dominated by the church for most of the 19th century as well, even though this is kind of when you start getting secular schools. So yeah, it's a great job. Thanks, guys. And let's go on to the next one. And it does a little score thing. Obviously, there's just a few of us here, so it's not a big deal. Okay, next question. What was the purpose of Napoleon's civil code? To repress the revolution and establish a dictatorship, to institute. Oh, you guys answered quickly. Great. Yes, to unite France, establish a single code of law, and provide stability. So there was a lot involved in his code, right? And we can go over that a little bit more, but the purpose of the code was to give France some stability after, decades of revolution and constitutional changes and all this stuff. Napoleon wanted to establish a single rule of law to cover all of France, and unite France in that way. Do you guys remember? So why is France, or let me rephrase that. France isn't like we think of it as today, right? Did everyone in France at the time even speak the same language? Right, Miguel says, I don't think so. Joshua, no. Yeah, they didn't, right? French was mostly spoken in Paris, outside of Paris and some of the other areas, especially the rural areas. You had all these different dialects. You had some that were more Italian-like languages, some a little more with Spanish influence. So, and in addition to that, you remember there's all these different little parliaments in each little town, different custom duties across the country. So there's really a lack of unity. So the idea behind the codes, one of the main ideas was to unite France by helping establish these secular schools and teaching the French language as one way to bring France together. A couple of the other things the code also talked about is it gave individual rights to choose your own occupation and religion. Again, there was a lot of although the majority of France was Catholic, there was diversity in religion there. So in another attempt to kind of bring people together by allowing more freedom. It also, the codes also kind of help reestablished some tradition. It reversed some of the gains that women had at the time, gave men more control in the family life, control over their children, um, less rights for women to own property and divorce, harsher penalties for women for things like adultery. Sorry, I'm just trying to read over a couple more notes I have on it. It also kind of restricted some of the workers' rights, favored more of the employees through state arbitration, which we still are kind of familiar with today, right? Arbitration, where a settlement can be reached between labor and capital. Slavery was reinstated by the codes. Although the French peasants remained free, slavery was definitely reinstated throughout all the colonies, right? Which is part of the problem going in Haiti at the time when Haiti had revolted. And, he also, Napoleon also established a national bank at this time through the codes and helped balance the budget. So he really does, these codes, as well as some of those other things, really add to the stability. And I think that's the main purpose and the point you want to take away from these codes. Yeah, so great job. You guys got that one right away. So on to the next one. What was the purpose of the Congress of Vienna? Establish a balance of power in Europe and gain stability, turn back the clock to before the Enlightenment and restore regimes, create a framework for settlement between major powers, or all of the above. And I do try to be a little tricky with these questions, so don't feel bad. Again, like I say, if you miss something, that's why we're doing this practice, is to go over it. Yeah, so it is all of the above. But yes, the main purpose was to definitely establish this balance of power, right? And recover or gain some stability because of this, again, decades of revolution and turmoil and war throughout Europe, caused from the revolution, from the French Revolution. But it did want to accomplish all of those things. Gain stability. Also, there was an attempt to reinstate a lot of the old regimes, in a sense, turn back the clock, focus on tradition, and create this framework, right, to settle future conflicts, to settle the current boundaries, international boundaries. Does anybody remember during the Congress of Vienna, what was the result, or how was France treated, even though they had lost the war? What kind of, did they become an occupied territory? What was kind of the result of the Congress of Vienna as far as France was concerned? Yeah, Joshua says their status was respected. So yes, and they had to maintain their actual original boundaries, right, prior to the war. So that's a pretty big deal, right? They really didn't lose a ton of territory. And when you say their status was respected, well, they were able to keep a certain, a certain amount of respect and power, right? So they were actually part of this balance of power. And most of the representatives at the Congress of Vienna recognized that without a powerful France, you couldn't maintain a balance of power in Europe, especially in continental Europe. So that is a big part of why they were given back most of their territory. So Miguel, you asked, did the Congress of Vienna happen before or after Napoleon was exiled? So he was defeated at this point, and I believe he was already sent to exile in Corsica, but I'm not 100% on what day he was actually, sent there. But I'm pretty sure he is sent there at this point or during the Congress of Vienna, because he has, been defeated at this point. And the Congress lasted, for I believe a couple months and stuff. It wasn't a quick thing. So I think he's already sent at this point, but I'm not 100%. Good question though. All right, so keep on rolling. Next one. What were the factors that led Britain to industrialize first? So as we talked about in the lecture, all of Europe obviously eventually industrializes, but Britain took the lead? And yes, you guys answered this one quickly. Powerful navy, commercial society, religious tolerance, and good geography. Yes, that is correct. Obviously, Britain had the most powerful navy at the time. And, they had a commercial society. So what does that mean when we say they had a commercial society? Does anybody want to elaborate on that? Yeah, Miguel, the Navy was definitely a major factor. I'm sure you could argue maybe the most important factor, right? But what does a commercial society mean in Britain compared to, say, France? Joshua, you say encourage consumerism, production, etc. Definitely, right? That was part of it. There's an emphasis on mercantilism throughout Europe, really, though, at this time, right? To the state to help encourage trade and production. Part of that production is, necessary for competition, right, between each other. What was the relationship between, say, these merchants and the aristocracy like in England versus France or other countries in Europe? You guys remember? Yeah, it's okay. I know that's why we're here, right? To review it. So don't feel bad. But basically, the point I'm trying to get at is the aristocracy in England was much smaller than, say, France, even Austria, Germany, Spain, these other areas. And really, the aristocracy wasn't quite as powerful either, right? Um, the monarchy obviously wasn't as powerful in England. We talked about that, how it evolved into this constitutional monarchy. So you have more of an openness in England to between the aristocracy and this rising part of the third estate, these merchants, these rich merchants. You have a openness and willingness for those two to work together. English aristocrats were more okay with the idea of making money. I know that seems silly to us now, but a lot of these aristocrats, they didn't really believe in working or anything. It was more of this idea: you're born with this, it's your right. You just live. You don't have to really, participating in commerce was kind of beneath you, right? Yeah, Joshua, you mentioned selling stuff wasn't seen as bad, and hard sciences were valued too, alongside abstract stuff. Yeah, no, yeah, that's the other part, right? So you have a commercial society where wealthy, established aristocrats are willing to work with talented, rising merchants, and you have a religious tolerance where science is more accepted, and particularly practical science that has more applications, right? So you have someone like Newton, who compared to, oh my gosh, sorry, I'm drawing a blank, Descartes or whatever, who, Descartes more focused on developing these philosophies and proving them theoretically through mathematics, where you have a guy like Newton who is more about taking those mathematical theories and proving them through experiments, right? Actual more practical science. But a lot of those scientists who were being oppressed in continental Europe because a lot of their stuff was anti-religious, right? Or challenged the church. Well, they were able to find a safe haven in England. And that's a big factor, right? Because you have innovations going on, across Europe, but you have even more so in England because of this religious tolerance. And then lastly, the good geography. Obviously, England is an island, and, it's harder to attack, which helps protect them from Napoleon. And then there's a ton of waterways and river access, which, before the railroads are developed, although England will go on to have more railroads than all of Europe really combined, before the railroads are developed, the waterways are the main source of transportation. So early on, England has a big advantage in having all these waterways. So yeah, great job, everybody. On to the next one. Okay, what were some of the defining values of the English middle class? And this is our last question. Women and children should work so the family can make more money. Success based on hard work and thrift. Respectable women should not work. They believed in big government and more regulations. They believed markets should be respected by the king so merchants have more power. Now this one's a little tricky. I didn't trick you guys up at all, though, huh? Or trip you guys up? Yes, the answer is that they believe success was based on hard work and thrift, and that respectable women should not work. Um, do either of you remember the famous writer who talked about this and actually wrote the self-help uh, book, kind of discussing middle class values? Yeah, it's not super important that you remember his name, but it's just these are good little facts to have when you're answering some of the essay questions. The more stuff you can remember is better, right, for the test. Samuel Smiles, he wrote Self Help, and it kind of re- restated some of these values, right? That poverty is the result of a lack of hard work and thrift, um, and these that respectable women should not work. They should spend their time doing domestic stuff, stay at home, go shopping, and many left the labor force as a result of this, right? Prior to industrialization and kind of the rise of this middle class. And of course, don't get me wrong, the lower classes, right? Women work, children work. But prior to this, even in like kind of more middle class families, working on a farm or whatever, the women would do their part, making household goods maybe, or also selling some of that stuff and doing piecemeal work, which does start at this time as well. But the higher up you go, the idea is the woman should be able to not work. Miguel says, I came to that answer simply because I remember learning that the middle class women don't work. Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is all familiar to us, right? Because a lot of our present day values, or at least a lot of 20th century values that we think of, um, were really developed at this time. Like ideas about the middle class, ideas about women staying home, about, men dominating workspace, or this kind of relationship between the sexes, right? It had really been a little more of a um, I don't know how to say, but more of a equal, not equal, but working together kind of relationship up to this point, where you have middle class kind of saying, no, that's not really how it should be. It should be that they don't have to work. Whereas before, yeah, it was more of everyone in the third estate, had to do whatever they could, and women helped out however they could. So, all right, great job with the Kahoot, guys. I really appreciate the participation. So yeah, so the first learning objective I wanted to talk about how Napoleon worked to take total power in France. I believe that's the first one under the Napoleon section. So we talked a little bit about what Napoleon did, and I know all of us talked in the icebreaker about kind of how we felt he was not a revolutionary. At least that was the opinion of us here today. But yeah, do you guys remember any of the things he did to take power? How did Napoleon, what gave him this advantage to be able to take over this position and end up emperor of France? The Concordat, Joshua says, right. So the compromise between the church and state. So that happens kind of after he's in power, right? He decides that we need to settle the conflicts between the church and the state. Miguel says, I think he was well respected by his people, seen as a mortal figure because he would be on the front lines leading charges. Yeah, so Miguel, you bring up one good point there, right? He was good in battle. He was a good leader. He gained the respect of his men. He won some really big, important battles in Italy, and the campaign of taking over the Italian peninsula. He did lose some in Egypt, but overall, he was very well respected militarily and had gained significant power that way. So that was definitely the first step, right? Joshua says Napoleon set the Legion of Honor, setting the military ranks according to merit over connections. Right, yeah, that's another important policy that he initiated, Joshua, but that's a little more to, and we'll actually talk about that on one of the other learning objectives, because that's more of his domestic policy, really, right? That's one of the things he did. But as far as taking power, I mean, you guys are on the right track, and he starts off militarily, right? Able to gain a lot of respect. But do you remember who who was in charge of France at the time Napoleon was doing these military campaigns? The revolutionaries, right, Miguel? Yeah. But do you remember the setup that the revolutionaries had? Was it a was there assembly in charge? Was it a smaller group of executives? I think I'm being a little uh, maybe a little confusing because I know there's a lot going on at this time. Yeah, Miguel says it was a small group, right? So it was the directory, was what it was called, right? The directory was consisted of, actually, I have to double check. I want to say 5 different uh, councilmen, but no one had solo complete control. Right, correct, Miguel. Yeah, so the directory's in charge, but at the same time, there's still a lot of instability, and they're fighting. France is fighting these wars, right, with Austria, fighting in Italy, fighting in continental Europe, even in Egypt, right, and it's it's a big toll on society, and they institute a draft, and the draft is um, there's a lot of pushback to the draft, creating a little more instability. And Napoleon's actually asked to come back to France to help take control. And there is a conspiracy to overthrow the directory. And we have what's called the Rump Assembly, where the assembly is shut down and you have a 3-man executive that take over and write a new constitution. Um, in the new constitution, there's no guarantee of rights, and Napoleon is selected as the Council of State, which gave him the power to basically make laws. There was no longer a legislative assembly, or the assembly had no power really at this point. And this is when Napoleon does some of those early kind of anti-republic things, right? He represses free speech, and even though he's claiming to be a proponent of democracy, right? This is when he makes the Concordat. So after he's become this Council of State, they've overthrown the directory. He then actually appoints himself lifetime council, roughly in 1802. Not that you have to know the date, and gives himself the power to not only change the Constitution but name a successor, right? And then a couple years later, he crowns himself emperor, with the Pope's blessing. But like I say, he wants to keep this separation still, between the church and state, and show his own power by crowning himself. So each one of those steps, right, Napoleon takes more control. And each time he kind of lessens the republic, the power of the republic. And he does it, like we mentioned in the icebreaker, I think Joshua or Miguel, I'm not sure who mentioned, but by repressing not only their rights, but holding these fixed elections, where he pretends there's democracy happening, but really the election's fixed and the outcome is going to be a yes vote on what Napoleon wants to do. So, let me just rehash that for the learning objective. And like I said, we can put this in the chart later. He wins major military victories, earns the loyalty of his troops. He's asked to come back because of some of the political unrest. They overthrow the directory, and then he becomes Council of State, eventually with a lifetime appointment, and then emperor. And like I said, each time he kind of makes changes. He has these fixed elections, and he lessens the power of the republic. Are there any questions on that? You guys good? Okay, great. I know we got about 15 minutes, so I want to try to get through at least a couple more of these, and then we might just skip to the closing. Started a little late today, so let's go on to the next one. Some of Napoleon's most notable domestic accomplishments. So Joshua, you already mentioned the Legion of Honor. That was definitely a big deal, right? Creating this system based on merit, also kind of reestablished the aristocracy, again, bringing more stability, right, to France. Yes, Miguel says increasing public education. He started those secular schools, part of his civil code, and that was definitely a big deal, one of his major accomplishments. Sorry, just flipping back through my notes as well. What were some of the other, can you guys think of any other ways he helped stabilize France? And I think I kind of mentioned these already, actually. You know, I'm just going to go ahead actually and show you guys what I have, because I think we talked a little bit about this. We talked about the National Bank. So like you mentioned, Miguel, he funded secular state schools. Joshua, you mentioned the Concordat and ending this conflict between the church and the state. That was obviously a big part of helping the stability, especially in the rural areas where the church was more popular. He established the Legion of Honor, and he helped balance the budget, and which added to more stability to France, right? And a lot of the balancing of the budget, I mean, yeah, he established a national bank, but they also got a lot of spoils from all these military victories, right? So it made it a lot easier to balance the budget. Any questions on that learning objective? And again, I'll go back and put some of this on that document so you guys have it for reference. All right, let's move on to the next one. The emergence of conservatism. So as you can tell too, if you're looking at all the learning objectives, I'm trying to touch on some of the ones that we didn't cover in the quiz. So yeah, do either of you remember what was the period after Napoleon called? What was the word for that time period? This is kind of the period after the Congress of Vienna, or you could throw that into that same time period. Romanticism, Joshua. Yeah, so that does start kind of around the same time period. And actually, I don't feel like Professor Bacco got to the Romanticism part so much yet, but yeah, that is around the same time period. But more of what I'm looking for is what they called the Restoration, right? So we mentioned already, talking about the Congress of Vienna, one of the goals was to restore some of the old regimes in Europe, and also this sense of going back to tradition, right? So the emergence of this conservatism comes during the Restoration, after Napoleon, and a lot of it's a reaction, right? A reaction to decades now of revolution, unrest, violence, right? You know, a lot of the wealthier aristocrats, first estate people were very upset about the terror and how many people lost their heads. So you have this period called the Restoration. They do reestablish some of the old regimes in Europe. They set up, of course, the balance of power we talked about with the Congress of Vienna. But it's also this idea that this violence was brought about by the revolution, and by this, or I'm sorry, the revolution and the violence was brought about by this emphasis on reason and the Enlightenment. So there's a push back towards tradition and monarchy. You know, you have guys like the Englishman, I think it's Edmund Burke, I just wrote Burke in the notes, but it's basically saying religion and tradition are essential to society, and reasons and rights couldn't replace that faith and tradition. Basically, the revolution moved too fast. You have all these things that are trying to get rid of this tradition, but the tradition, especially religion and stuff, are really essential. Otherwise, we end up with all this instability and violence. However, that's not to say that these revolutionary ideas died, right? They wouldn't go away, as Professor Bacco talked about. But so with that emergence of conservatism, you have the reestablishment of the French monarchy with Louis XVIII. But at the same time, you know, they keep the civil codes of Napoleon. Some of the church land that had been sold, those people get to keep it. And they establish a parliament with some limited suffrage. So it's not a complete return, but it's definitely a turn back towards things before the revolution, before enlightenment. So you end up with this movement also just in France and throughout Europe, where they're really emphasizing religion over reason as a way to salvation. So just kind of a re-emphasis on religion's role. You know, like I said, the revolutionaries had almost wholly rejected religion completely. So yeah, are there any questions on that? Let me pull up the layout here. So believed in enlightenment had led to revolution and violence, monarchy and tradition essential to society and religion. Reasons and right cannot replace that. French monarchy reestablished, and the religious revival emphasizing religion over reason. So when you're defining these learning objectives, it's important to think about, you know, all the key facts, and you want to remember as much as you can, but you do want to try to focus on the important stuff, and, you know, kind of write these little concise notes that can help you to study and help you remember all this, right? Yeah, Mikhail, yeah, I forgot about them reestablishing King Louis. Yeah, I know. Honestly, I kind of forgot about that too before. I hadn't taken a European history class in a while, so I kind of forgot about that. And he does kind of fade away. I don't remember exactly how it ends. A couple more, I think there's a couple more Louis in there, but definitely not the same as like a Louis the 14th we talked about, right? And the absolute monarch situation there. But there is a pushback towards this and a belief that some of that tradition is needed to maintain order in society. So let's see, we got about 8 minutes. I want to do one more, and then I think we'll switch to our closing. Okay, I think I had a couple more on here, but we'll get to review more of these learning objectives as we go on, and we'll definitely, before any midterm or before the midterm, we'll have a longer session where we can go over more of them in some of the regular SI sessions as well. So okay, so we talked about the factors led to Britain becoming the first industrialist nation, but what do you guys remember about the factors that led to Europeans to industrialize? Some of the more world, some of the relationships as far as the difference between Europe and say China or Asia and how things were developing. Yeah, Joshua says competition with Asia and other countries, especially with imports. Definitely right. That's that mercantilism again. The idea that we need to export more than we import. We need to create more stuff instead of just buying stuff from Asia and China so that we can keep more of our gold and silver, right? What other factors kind of what about the relationship in Europe itself that helps lead to industrialization? The relationship between the countries in Europe. You guys remember anything on kind of the setup there? What happened after, if you go way back to the fall of Rome? Miguel says, I think the major European powers um, industrialized Britain, France, and Germany, mainly, not Spain and others, since they had problems that forced them to be late. Yeah, so that is a good point, Miguel. Yeah, you do have Britain and France and Germany, some geographical features that helped with that, right? Like access to coal, although there were accesses to stuff like that in Spain, right? You overall, you know, we talked about the factors that led, yeah, there was natural abundance, yeah, throughout Europe, right? So this is a big advantage Europe has when it comes to industrialization over other parts of the world, but also, you know, certain geographical factors for places like Britain. But in general, what you have happening in Europe after the fall of Rome is you have all these small kingdoms, you know, relatively small. You know, we think about today still, right? All the countries in Europe, they're more like states in America as far as size, right? And you have hundreds of years, you know, 3 or 4 centuries really or longer, after the fall of Europe, where you have these little states competing, and there's pretty fierce competition, not just for trade and stuff, but militarily, right, to conquer and territorial disputes. And this leads to a need to develop, right, especially militarily, more technology. Um, and then as they develop that military technology and we get into this era of colonization and trade, they're also developing more technology with how to produce materials or manufacture goods. Excuse me. And that really is a big advantage for the European countries. And then also, like we talked about earlier in the class, when you start having some of this centralized power, with whether it's like Louis XIV and other absolute monarchs, they again also emphasize this need for competition. They support the arts, they support education and ways to find advantages to beat their rivals. And comparatively, China, the world power, right? The only world power really for all of history up until industrialization. But although there was internal conflict in China and conflict between, the Hans and the Mongolians and things like that, different dynasties in China. I think that's right, Hans. But you don't have as much competition for China with other states, and it's a relatively closed economy that's able to produce everything it needs. So it's a little more stagnant. Whereas in Europe, there's just a push for more and more as this competition grows. So let me just go to that real quick. So yeah, like I said, the failure for them to reunite after the fall of Rome led to more competition. You had state-supported science and technology, a focus on trade and mercantilism. And lastly, which I didn't mention, is the colonies, right? The Americas, not just America, but all of South America, the Caribbean. You have a ton of silver, especially in like Spain, right? Gold also, sugar, slaves, cotton, food. It's huge resources. It's a huge advantage for Europe, because prior to this, Europe had to go to Asia for all of its spices and things that were really valuable. And now all of a sudden it has some really valuable commodities and resources that it can access to help give it a boost over Asia and other countries, other world dominant countries like the Ottomans or the Chinese empires at the time. So next week we'll have a session, Wednesday the 10th, 12:30 to 2. We'll continue to talk about the learning objectives, and then the following week we'll do another one of these VSI sessions on Friday. So that's going to be kind of how it goes for the rest of the semester.